Diana was gone. The crash happened on August 31st, 1997. The world watched. The world mourned. And then Charles Spencer gave his eulogy. It was powerful, raw. In those few minutes at her funeral, he spoke about his sister with an honesty that shocked people. He talked about her inner life, about her pain, about the way she had been hunted. It was the most honest thing a family member had said publicly about Diana. And then he stopped talking. People didn't realize it at first, but slowly over weeks and months, it became clear. Charles Spencer wasn't doing interviews about his sister. He wasn't writing about her. He wasn't defending her against criticism. He wasn't telling her story. After that one powerful speech, he closed the door. For 30 years, he would barely open it again. Althorp House became his life. The estate in Northamptonshire, centuries old, filled with art and history and family secrets locked in stone. He inherited it in 1992, 5 years before Diana died. So when she was gone, he already owned the place where her body would be laid, already owned the grounds where her grave would rest, already carried the weight of the family legacy. But the weight got heavier. People wanted to know why he wasn't defending Diana. Her friends spoke out. Her lovers spoke out. Her staff wrote books. Journalists hunted for answers. But Charles stayed silent. His silence felt like an accusation somehow, like he was protecting someone, like he was hiding something, like maybe the story everyone knew wasn't the full story. Inside Althorp, visitors came in a steady stream. Tourists, royal watchers, people who wanted to see where the princess slept as a child, where her body had rested before the funeral, where her grave now stood on an island in a lake. Charles managed all of it, gave tours sometimes, managed the shrine his sister had become, answered the questions when he had to. But about Diana herself? About what happened to her? About what he knew? That was different. Years passed. The 90s became the 2000s. Diana's memory was frozen in time, in photographs, in conspiracy theories, in the mythology the world had created around her. Books appeared. The Diana Papers. Diana, her true story. Documentaries aired. Theories spread about what really happened in that tunnel in Paris. Was it an accident? Was it something else? Did someone want her dead? Charles didn't answer these questions. He watched from Althorp while the world argued about his sister's life and death, while strangers claimed to know her better than he did, while the narrative got written and rewritten by people who had never met her. His mother was still alive then. Frances Shan Kidd. She was Diana's mother. She lived with her own grief, her own knowledge, her own version of events. Charles sometimes gave interviews where he referenced conversations with her, but never the details, never the specifics. Always protected, always safe. Friends noticed something about him during those years. A heaviness, a weight that didn't lift. He would attend events. He would sit on boards. He would work on projects at Althorp. But something was absent. Some part of him seemed locked away. Journalists who watched him over the decades noticed the pattern. After the eulogy, almost nothing. A few careful statements. A measured interview here and there. But never the confession people sensed he was holding. Never the revelation that seemed to sit just beneath the surface of every public appearance. So, you see, the question became, what was he protecting? Who was he protecting? Did he know something so damaging that silence was the only option? Or had he simply decided that some things were too private, too painful to ever share? For 3 decades, Charles Spencer carried that question around Althorp like a ghost. Visitors came to see his sister's grave. He managed the estate. He lived his life. But the silence remained. Unbroken, unexamined, a stone wall that nobody could penetrate. And then something changed. Maybe it was time, maybe it was age, maybe it was realizing that the story was being told without him, that his silence itself had become a kind of story, a silence so profound it raised questions louder than any words could. Whatever the reason, the door that had been closed for 3 decades began, ever so slightly, to crack open. Althorp House is not a normal home. It's a fortress of stone and history and privilege, one of the greatest estates in England, built and rebuilt over centuries, filled with paintings that museums would envy, sculptures from famous artists, libraries full of first editions. Every room holds some piece of the family's past. Charles Spencer inherited it in 1992. He was 28 years old. Suddenly, he owned all of it. The responsibility was enormous. But it was also a sanctuary, a place where he could disappear if he needed to, where he could control who came inside, where he could manage what was seen and what was hidden. When Diana died 5 years later, Althorp became something else entirely. It became a memorial. Her body was kept there before the funeral service, and then, after everything was over, her grave was placed on an island in the middle of a lake on the grounds. An island that could only be reached by boat. A grave surrounded by water. Protected. Isolated. Peaceful. It was also a prison. For the next 3 decades, Charles managed that grave. He managed the pilgrims who came to see it. Tourists arrived by the thousands. Royal watchers. Diana fans. People who felt like they knew her, like they owned some piece of her story. Security had to be constant. Gates had to be locked. The estate that had been a family home became, in some ways, a shrine. So, you see, Charles didn't just inherit a house. He inherited a monument to his sister. He inherited the burden of protecting her memory. He inherited the weight of being asked about her by strangers, by journalists, by people who felt entitled to his family's grief. Inside those walls, he continued his life. He had children. They grew up at Althorp, surrounded by their aunt's legacy. He worked on conservation projects. He sat on boards and committees. He gave the occasional interview about estate management, about history, about art, but never about Diana. Not in any way that revealed the complexity beneath the surface. Those close to him said something was different, something heavy. After the funeral, after that powerful eulogy, something shifted inside him. Like he had said everything he was ever going to say, like the rest was locked away, and the key had been thrown into the lake with Diana's grave. Friends would visit Althorp and sense it, a kind of weight in the rooms. Journalists who interviewed him picked up on it too. He was polite, intelligent, careful, but closed, sealed, shut, like the island where his sister rested. The question that whispered through royal circles for years was simple but enormous. What does Charles know? Did he witness something that changed him? Did Diana tell him things she told nobody else? Was his silence protecting the family, protecting the truth, or protecting himself? Actually, the question was even deeper than that. In those 30 years at Althorp, managing his sister's grave, managing the tourists, managing the endless questions about what happened and why, was Charles protecting something else entirely? Was he managing not just the estate but his own knowledge, his own role in events, his own relationship with a sister who died when she was only 36? The weight never lifted. Year after year at Althorp, it just got heavier. More tourists came. More documentaries aired. More books appeared. The world's obsession with Diana only grew. And Charles remained behind his gates, managing the memorial to his sister, carrying something unspoken that nobody could quite see, but everyone could sense was there. It was the burden finally became too much to carry alone. People don't break silence without reason. Not after 30 years. Something has to shift. A moment has to arrive when staying quiet feels like a choice that costs more than speaking up. For Charles Spencer, several things happened at once. New documentaries about Diana kept appearing. Different angles, different claims. Some blamed the royal family. Some blamed the paparazzi. Some offered wild theories about conspiracies and cover-ups. But none of them, Charles believed, told the story quite right. None of them captured what he knew, what he had witnessed, what his sister had told him in private moments that the world never heard. And he was watching these documentaries get made and distributed and watched by millions. Watched by his own children. Watched by people who would believe these versions of events because they were the only versions available. Because Charles wasn't offering an alternative. New books appeared too. Authors who had interviewed Diana's friends, Diana's former lovers, Diana's staff. Everyone who had ever known her seemed to publish their memories. Everyone except her brother. Except the person who had known her since childhood. Except the one person who might have offered real insight. But he stayed silent. At the same time, something personal was happening. Charles was getting older. Not old, but aging. The perspective that comes with age shifts something in a person. He was becoming a grandfather. He was thinking about legacy, about what he wanted to leave behind, about what story his children and grandchildren would inherit, about whether the version of events that the world believed was actually true. Wait, let me tell you what else was happening. He was watching his sister's sons grow up. Prince William, Prince Harry. They were making their own documentaries now, speaking about Diana themselves, their version of events, their memories of her. And Charles was watching them make choices about how to talk about their mother, about whether to stay silent or speak. It made him think about his own choices. There was frustration in those years, real frustration. He had sat in silence while his sister's ex-husband, now King Charles, had moved on with his life, had married again, had built a new narrative. Charles watched his mother die, watched her take her own stories, her own knowledge, her own version of events to the grave, and he thought, how much longer will I do the same? At some point, staying quiet started to feel different. It stopped feeling like protection. It started feeling like complicity, like he was allowing a version of history to stand unchallenged when he knew something different. Like his silence was actually a betrayal of his sister. Like, by not speaking, he was actually taking sides. Close friends noticed at first. A small shift, nothing dramatic. But Charles started saying things he hadn't said before. He started correcting people when they got the story wrong. He started being willing to go on record. Started saying things that journalists would catch and report. Started opening the door. Just slightly, but opening it nonetheless. He gave interviews where he referenced private conversations with his mother. He made statements about how Diana had been treated. He suggested that things were more complicated than the public narrative allowed. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a dramatic confession. But it was a break. The door that had been closed was moving. Charles Spencer is not a man who goes on television and makes wild accusations. That's not who he is. He's aristocratic, careful, measured. When he finally decided to speak more openly after 3 decades of silence, he did it the way an aristocrat does things. Quietly, with precise language, with statements that journalists had to really pay attention to catch. He started talking about his mother more openly. Frances Shan Kidd, Diana's mother. She had her own complicated history with the royal family. She had conflicts. She had regrets. She had lived through Diana's marriage and her struggles. She had been there. She had seen things. And Charles had spoken to her about those things. So, when Charles began referencing conversations with his mother, when he started dropping hints about family dynamics that were more complex than people realized, he was essentially saying, my mother knew things. I know things. And the story you've been told is incomplete. He started hinting at Diana's marriage troubles too. Not gossip, but suggesting that the difficulties in her relationship with Prince Charles had deeper roots than the public understanding. That there were complications nobody had really discussed. That the fairy tale the world wanted to believe was actually much darker. He never said it directly. That wasn't his style. But he was saying it. Then came something more significant. Charles started making comments about the royal court itself, about advisors, about courtiers, about the institution that his sister had married into. He started suggesting, very carefully, that certain people had let Diana down, that the system had failed her, that the people closest to her had not protected her the way they should have. Actually, he was suggesting something even more serious, that the royal family, the institution itself, had failed Diana in ways that went beyond the obvious, in ways that people hadn't really examined. These weren't shocking statements. They weren't attacking King Charles or specific individuals by name. They weren't accusing anyone of crimes. But they were breaking something that had never been broken before. The code of silence, the unwritten rule that family business stayed private, that you didn't criticize the institution publicly. Charles Spencer was breaking that rule. The media caught it immediately. Journalists who had been watching Charles Spencer for decades suddenly realized something fundamental had shifted. A door that had been locked was opening, and the person opening it was Diana's own brother, the one person whose voice actually mattered, the one person you couldn't dismiss as an outsider or a conspiracy theorist or someone with an axe to grind. In interviews, Charles started talking about systemic failures, about how institutions protect themselves, about how image management can sometimes prevent you from actually caring for people who need help, about how his sister had been caught in a system that was more interested in appearances than in her actual well-being. Each statement was measured, each one was careful, but they all pointed to something bigger, something hidden, something that had been protected for 3 decades by the silence of the one person who actually knew. The silence was broken, not all at once, but broken. Charles Spencer began making specific statements about events and people. In interviews and public appearances, he started revealing things that hadn't been public before, things he had kept inside for 3 decades, things that complicated the official narrative that everyone had accepted. He talked about how Diana was treated by the people closest to her, not in a gossipy way, in a way that suggested real harm, real neglect, real failure from people who were supposed to love her and protect her. He talked about the media intrusion too, about the hunting, about the photographs, about the paparazzi who followed her constantly. But he also suggested something more complex, that the royal family in some ways had enabled this system, that they had fed it with information and staged moments, that they had benefited from Diana's visibility even as it was destroying her. More importantly, Charles started talking about his own experience, about being left out, about not being consulted about his sister's well-being, about watching his sister suffer and feeling powerless to help because the institution controlled everything, because the people in power didn't want his input or his protection. It was personal, not angry, but definitely personal. Then came the more difficult conversations. Charles started discussing the circumstances that led to Diana's death. Not the accident itself, not the crash, but the environment that created that moment. The stress Diana was under, the isolation she felt, the constant media chase, the systems that put her in danger, the people who benefited from her vulnerability. He didn't say that King Charles caused Diana's death. He didn't say that Prince William or anyone specific killed her. But he implied something equally serious, that institutional failures and poor choices had created an environment where tragedy became possible, that people in power had allowed a situation to develop where his sister ended up dead in a car being chased by photographers. You see, the implication was devastating because it suggested that her death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the result of systemic failures, of people choosing image over substance, of institutions protecting themselves over protecting vulnerable people. Charles also spoke about Diana's mental health struggles, not cruelly, not in a way that embarrassed her, but in a way that suggested she hadn't received the help she needed, that the royal family had minimized her suffering, that people who could have helped had chosen not to. And then there were the most sensitive revelations, details about private conversations, things Diana had told him that she told nobody else, doubts she had expressed, fears she had shared. Some of this information was brand new. Some of it contradicted what official sources had said. Some of it suggested that the official narrative about Diana, the one the royal family had largely controlled and accepted, was actually quite incomplete. It was a slow, steady unraveling of a carefully managed story. And Charles Spencer, the brother who had stayed silent for 30 years, was the one pulling the threads. For the royal family, Charles Spencer's willingness to speak created a problem they couldn't easily solve. He wasn't a disgruntled employee. They couldn't dismiss him as unreliable or motivated by money or seeking attention. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist spouting wild theories on social media. He was Diana's brother. Blood. Family. The keeper of Althorpe, the man who managed her grave, he had credibility in a way that nobody else could have. More than that, he had knowledge, private knowledge, things that only a family member would know, conversations with his sister, observations from childhood, moments of vulnerability that she had only shared with him, understanding of family dynamics that outsiders could never possess. He was, in many ways, the most dangerous voice to the institution because he was the most believable. The royal family's response was interesting. They didn't attack him publicly. They didn't issue strong denials. They didn't fight back aggressively. Instead, they chose a strategy of quiet disapproval combined with minimal comment. Let it be known that they didn't appreciate what he was saying. But don't engage directly. Don't amplify his voice by arguing with him. It was a controlled response, but the very fact that they didn't respond strongly suggested something. If everything Charles was saying was false, wouldn't they say so? Wouldn't they mount a defense? Wouldn't they discredit him? Instead, silence, which meant either his claims had enough truth to them that responding would be dangerous, or the palace understood that fighting with Diana's brother would look bad. Either way, his voice remained uncontested. And then there was the psychological dimension of it all. Charles wasn't saying he had said everything. In interviews, it was clear that he was being careful, measured, protecting some things, which meant that everyone listening understood there's more. There's information he's not revealing. There are things he's chosen to keep private. Actually, this was more damaging than a direct accusation, because it created suspicion. It created the sense that worse things were being protected, that if Charles Spencer spoke fully, if he revealed everything he knew, the institution would crumble, that his silence was actually merciful, that he was protecting the royal family by not saying certain things. For an institution built on control and managed narrative, this was a nightmare. They couldn't force him to stay silent anymore. They couldn't prevent him from speaking. They could only watch as he, piece by piece, began to rewrite the official story. The brother they had ignored for 3 decades had become their most serious problem.